Hello!
Hi.
And welcome to another edition of Story World Explorers, where we're exploring the story world of... Actually, we're not exploring the story world today. We're
That's
actually
right.
learning something about folklore.
That's right. We had author and narrative designer Nick Jones on talking about his book, The Player and the Pentacle, which is all about introducing and having folklore in a story world. Very specifically about video games, but we were talking about all types of story world.
Broadly speaking, any story world can benefit from having stories told about the world itself.
Right.
And the difference between a myth, a legend, and a fairy tale, while most people think are all the same thing, they're actually very different and are all layers that you can help develop a living, breathing world.
That's right. Nothing feels better than when you're walking around in a video game and people are talking about something, whether that be a fairy tale, a myth, or a legend, and you learn different clues and you find out how and why people think the way that they do. Why do they go the places that they go? What kind of religions do they have? This all stems from folklore and folklore-esque. So it was a great episode, highly educational, highly recommended if you are trying to develop your own story world or getting kind of stuck or, because when you get to tell stories about your stories, that's when the fun really starts. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's coming right up. Or if you'd like to listen to it, it's available on all podcast platforms. Enjoy
The show.
All right, great. Well, we are on with Nick Jones, senior narrative designer at Shark Mob Games, and also the author of The Player and the Pentacle. Nick, thank you so much for being on with us. It's whenever you get to talk to somebody that really does live and breathe transmedia, such as yourself, and as a student of the genre, it's always a lot of fun to have these conversations. And this one in particular, with this book that you wrote about narrative design in video games, and kind of the importance of some of this mythology and the folklore that you could take for granted, but the real video game players, real players that really do enjoy that stuff, that explore every nook and cranny of an explorable world. How important all that stuff is. And this is going to be more of an educational, akin to our conversations with Jeff Gomez and with Houston Howard on Transmedia itself,
Right.
And the benefits, rather than exploring an actual world. But you know what? You need to know how to navigate and create your own stuff, and otherwise you'll never find a new world to explore.
And this is just when we get to nerd out about all the different things about how you could create a living, breathing world that feels authentic to your audience
and make the audience never want to leave. So let's start off. Let's kick off. What is this book? What was the inspiration behind it? Give us the author's inside take.
Yeah, hey guys, it's good to be here finally after I don't know how long we've been planning this, but it's been a while at this point. But yeah, no, my book, I guess really it came out of a lot of sort of thought around folklore and around storytelling when I was doing my one of my masters a few years ago, and started to sort of develop into an idea that I eventually sort of took on as a PhD. But really, it came from, funnily enough, a YouTube video that I actually reference in the book about the Cthulhu mythos and the way that H.P. Lovecraft, for all his faults, created a universe or a mythology that is possibly the closest we have in modernish times to being similar to how a real world canon of folklore develops. And he did this through sort of half-assing it in a way, which is kind of funny, but there were these sorts of props and gods and characters that he would sort of reference offhand in his stories, and never really fully explain them. They were sort of just little background props that he would move around to help with his storytelling in general. And then the other thing that he did was he had a group of writers that he conferred with constantly, and they would be reading each other's stories. They would be writing stories that included these props from each other's stories. They were sort of sharing these things around, and so what ended up happening was this sort of natural growth of a larger mythology that relied on these props, which is very similar to how real life folklore develops. And it's what's called mimetic circulation, which is this idea that cultures play like kind of a game of telephone with each other over many, many years. The Greeks have a story and then they share it with the Romans, and then the Romans go, we like that story, but we're going to change this, this, and this to fit our culture. And then a new version starts up, and then they share it with someone else, and it sort of spreads. Um, and so that idea was really, really fascinating to me because it got me thinking as a narrative designer, how do you utilize that same sort of approach for video games? And that was sort of the cornerstone of the idea, really, which over time evolved. I didn't actually want to do a PhD initially, but I was convinced or told to do it multiple times by all my lecturers when I started thinking about this. And so yeah, I started looking at this from a PhD perspective and thinking about how you can utilize folklore and folkloric motifs to create better story worlds, particularly for video games because that's my background, but all sorts of story worlds really. And yeah, that gradually progressed into me having like a large enough body of work around this idea that I thought, well, I might as well put it into a book and sort of um, make it easier to understand than just the sort of academic approach, so that other people in my industry and neighboring industries can enjoy it and hopefully get something from it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely fantastic, and we will have information of how to download the book, which is available on Amazon, um, for you guys all to read because it is quite the journey, and I think that one of the most interesting parts of it was this idea of folklore-esque. And folklore-esque, to my understanding, I did do a little bit of reading. Nick, you put a lot of references in there, and so I picked up a couple of books, and one of them was the folklore-esque. I just looked at it because I was like, when I was writing the notes for it, I was like, I want to make sure I spelled this right. I was spelling it ESSC, and I was like, that's not it. And then I was like, oh, it's got the QUE at the end. And I looked up the title. But what's interesting is there is this constant battle, and this is kind of like a sidebar. It's a constant battle between folklorists and then people, the folklorists, people that do the study of folklore, and how they somewhat discount the new stuff that's coming out. That a lot of it is from these story worlds of a Star Wars or of a larger world that allows people to go in and make up their own ideas and their own stories and their own interpretations of the core work. And they are what's ended up happening is this new term folklore-esque is kind of coming out of it. And so why don't let's talk a little bit about what folklore-esque is, and how important it is to attach that back, or how important like folklore is to the human experience. And thus, if you really want to make like a great world, folklore or folklore-esque is really important to develop, to have somebody actually feel like they're a part of something, or that they can participate in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess in the briefest of terms, the folkloresque is this idea that a piece of work, a video game, a film, a TV show, whatever, um, initially gives this feeling to the audience that it derives from folklore or from traditions that are much older, stories that are much older than it is itself. But usually, when you sort of dig into that a little bit more, you start to realize that, well, uh, this isn't really based on any one particular tradition, but on a bunch of different ones from around the world, or the traditions that have been slightly twisted in a way to sort of make them new and unique. I believe, yeah, the professor that sort of first termed this, his name's Michael Foster. Um, Don't quote me on that. But he sort of talked about in his book on this, how he was asked to give a talk on Spirited Away, from Studio Ghibli, and talk about the folkloric origins behind that film. And he started to realize as he was going through it, this doesn't really follow Shintoism. Yeah, there are sort of kami creatures or yokai creatures in it, but there's no direct correlation to what's actually in the mythology. And that's sort of where he sort of started thinking about it in that way. But it's a really interesting concept because it gives you a lot of freedom to play, right, and to explore things in a way that allows you to create a more interesting, more in-depth, large world. And I think one of my favorite quotes by him about this, that sums it up really nicely, is that he says something along the lines of pop culture aspires to be folklore. That's the ultimate goal of pop culture, is to become folklore. And so I think that's something really worth taking an interest in, and keeping in mind when you're creating worlds, that the stories that last, the stories that carry over from generation to generation. Star Wars is a great modern example. They start to morph and start to become folklore or folkloresque. So yeah, I think it's a great lens to look at modern stories through, and it's also a great lens to have when you're creating your own stories.
Right. Yeah. And this idea that like how it's so interwoven with the human experience, right? So you were talking earlier about how we have these like the game of telephone that's going on, right? Between
Mm-hmm.
different cultures. And how really a lot of the folklore, and I'm going to ask you to define some of the difference between a fairy tale and a legend and a myth in a second, but how all those different pieces end up shaping shaping really just an entire culture, going all the way down to myths to teach moral lessons of stuff, and like how to keep people on the straight and narrow or in line with whatever the culture's
Yeah.
not priority list. What am I thinking? Values are, and reinstating that.
Well, it also goes to show you too that like in order for in order for us to in order for a culture to be real in a story we're telling, the culture has to tell stories about itself. It's like that's what it comes down to. It's like we need stories to communicate, to create other stories.
Sure.
Like, because that's I mean, essentially that's a human like experience. We just are a collection of stories and experiences. So in order for your story world to feel real, it needs to have stories about itself in the story world.
Right.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate assessment, I think. Storytelling, it's possibly one of the oldest traditions that we have as human beings. And when you look at the sort of origins of storytelling, the sorts of things that we were telling each other when we were cavemen, and the ways that we were telling those stories, it's very much conversational in nature, right? The idea of a story being something that an author writes down or develops and then gives it out to an audience and they just sort of passively digest it, is a relatively new concept when you think about it in terms of like deep time and in terms of the human experience. Prior to that, you would have campfires with a village elder or a priest or a shaman or whatever, right? That would be telling a story to help the rest of the community exist in the world. This is where you get the hero's journey from, right? They had to go out of the normal world into the dangerous world and bring back some sort of treasure to help their community. And part of this interaction was a conversational nature. So you would have other people listening and they would interject and be like, well, there's this thing here, like this saber-toothed tiger here that you need to avoid, and then the storyteller would include that in their story. at the same time. So there's this sort of back and forth always, which is why, like in my book, I talk about uh, there's a sort of mistake that people can make that think that things like video games and nonlinear storytelling are a modern invention, but really it's a quite an ancient tradition.
Mm.
So yeah, very communal, very about people. I One of the things I say in my book is that folklore is this idea of like nose to nose. It's intimate, it's close up, it's about us and about how we interact with the world. And because of that, it's incredibly important to have in your story worlds, because that's where you get that human element from, in a lot
Right.
of ways. That's where you get that intimacy.
Right. Yeah, that's how information is passed. I remember when we were just kind of talking about a little whiles back. Our pre-conversation was a little earlier, or late last year. That we were talking about how and I think it was like it wasn't a specific game, but how you could be talking to a group of people in a mountainous area and they have the same story, but then when you go down into the valley, it changes ever so slightly. And this kind of idea of like, well, it is that game of telephone, right? And then there are people that added stuff to it and embellished certain things for certain specific reasons, or omitted certain things for whatever reason. But it gives this kind of fabric of like something not seen, but it's definitely there, and that's so apparent in the human experience of just those oral traditions and things that we grow up on. And
Yeah.
that's one of the arguments or thoughts that I had when I was reading it. That was like, well, well, Star Wars really isn't folklore, but I'm like, people use stories from that to teach their kids lessons. So I don't know. I think we're getting pretty close
Yeah.
to jumping over
Yeah,
that
yeah.
line.
Yeah.
You have the Jedi religion as well, right? So
Right.
there's a however ridiculous it might be, I don't know too much about it, but there is a belief system that has developed as a result of that story world, which is classic folklore, classic
Right.
folk tales.
Right. Exactly.
And it makes sense that like if it is such, like, because a lot of times people say that there is no more unique stories, like every story has really been told. It's just how different can you tell it, and the difference between how this folkloric story can be told in the mountain versus the valley could just be like, as in Little Red Riding Hood. Like in Germany, it was a wolf because they had wolves there. In China, there is a tiger because they have tigers there. So it's like the core of the story might not change much, but the different things, the signifiers of just the terrain you're in and the dangers that are out there. Like if it was a tiger in Germany, people are like, I've never seen a tiger. Have you ever seen a tiger?
I guess
you
we
know?
can walk
Yeah,
around. It'd be
yeah.
fine. Right.
Yeah. Well, I was actually looking the other day at a lot of folklore from sort of the northern Italian region
Mm.
around the sort of the Alps, right? And one thing that came up there was that uh, there were some very interesting folk beliefs from the people that sort of existed there before the people that we sort of think of as like Italians or the Roman Empire, right?
Right.
And uh, the one group of people exist. They lived sort of down on the flatlands in front of the mountains, and then another were further up in the foothills and the mountains, and they had the same sorts of beliefs, same sorts of stories, but in the flatlands, one of the characters was comparable to the Greek god Zeus, uh, and then in the mountains, that same character became more of like a they were still like a thunder god, but they were more of a troll, a mountain troll sort of figure.
Hmm.
Mm.
So that's a great example there of how the higher up mountainous area changes the story to fit with what they know.
Right,
Mm.
right.
Right.
And yeah, a little teaser about why you're researching stuff in the Northern Alps was one of your projects that you moved a regular production meeting to join us here, so we very much thank you for that. Ancestral, which, you know, hopefully we'll have you on to talk about that and actually dive into a story world, because that one's fascinating. But yeah, so we have this thing, right? We need folklore in our story worlds. What are some of the elements to help create that life, right? Like we can, I think what's really interesting, we've already kind of covered it, is that the video games or any kind of story world, it's going to take things they like from other folkloric pastimes, right? If you like the idea of Mount Olympus, you might adapt that to your own games or story world folklore, right? It might have similar themes, but then that doesn't mean that you just have to stick with the Greeks. You can go wherever the heck you want. You can go across to native North America. You can go to South America, anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And pick and choose pieces of storytelling, of traditions, of values, and then bring them together to make your own folklore, your tales, the myths, the fairy tales, all of that stuff, and really make something relatively unique while still using tried and true things.
Yeah, and I think that now it's a good time to define those terms that kind of that are part of your folklore. You know, there are specific subcategories for characters, and I think those are good idea. It's a good idea now to kind of explain those, because you have to layer all these things to create actual believable story world about the story world that you're creating. So I think it's like fairy tale versus myth versus legend.
Yeah. So this was one of the first things that I came across when I started researching this sort of subject. Was I was under the mistaken belief, like many other people, I've noticed. I still have many arguments with my co-workers at Shark Mob from time to time about these things, but there's this idea that myth, legend, folktale are all interchangeable words, right? And the truth is that they're not. They're different subcategories of the larger body of folklore. And the reason why we've sort of muddled this all together is this concept of semantic change, right? Where words that mean one thing gradually evolve into meaning something else. So awesome to us means great, like exciting, but awesome way back meant awe-inspiring and terrifying. So this is sort of what's happened with these words. But if you can sort of break them down and understand the differences between them, then it gives you three different tools or tool sets really to work with to layer story into your world. So very quickly, to give you a rundown of the different definitions, we'll start with legend, right? So a legend is essentially a story that is considered to have a basis in history. So this is something that it may or may not have happened, but the culture that tells it believes that it did happen at some point. And over many years of telling and retelling, more fantastical elements might have been added, things might have been smushed together. All this sort of growth and evolution has occurred, but at its core, it's historical. So something like, let me think, Troy, right? The story of Troy. Now, it's debatable whether there was a war between Greece and Troy in the way that we understand it, with Brad Pitt and Sean Bean and all those guys fighting it out in skimpy outfits. But the Greeks believed that Troy, the Trojan War, did happen. And there are actually archaeological ruins that archaeologists suspect is the original city of Troy, though they haven't found any evidence of a war actually happening there. But that story is a prime example of a legend, because the core concept of it was believed to be historical. King Arthur is another great one. King Arthur was most likely a barbarian tribesman who led a bunch of other barbarians to kill a bunch of people, and then was glorified over years and years and years, and that developed over time and mixed
Yeah.
with Christianity when that moved into that part of the world, and sort of became what we know today as the Arthurian myths. So that's sort of what legends are. Basis in history, have evolved and grown and changed over time, but there is a kernel of historical truth usually in it. Um, Myths, on the other hand, are I talk about them as opera. They're on a grander, more cosmic scale. So these are stories about gods. These are stories that are about the creation of the world, about massive things that we don't understand, and they usually have morals connected to them, right? So they typically connected to the religious beliefs of the culture that are telling them, and are designed to convey those religious beliefs and teach them to the next generation. And then you have fairy tales or folk tales. That those two are kind of interchangeable, but these are stories that are much more personal. These are small stories. These are like we were talking about before, nose to nose. They're between people within the same community, and they are typically designed to explain smaller events that we don't understand. Like what's out in the forest that keeps dragging our children off, or why is the weather doing what it's doing at the moment, and how do we protect ourselves from the undead? Like these are folk stories. Interestingly, folk stories also include things like urban myths. So Bloody Mary, the what's some other urban myths? The hitchhiker urban myth, right? Or the woman in white. Like these are folk tales as well, because they're small, they're personal, they're about
Right.
us as people and us grappling to understand the world around us. The interesting thing about all of these categories, but specifically folktales to a greater degree, is the way in which, and we talked about this just before, the way in which, depending on where they are being told, they will change. Um, Folktales in particular, often you'll find competing versions of the same folktale within a small area, or versions that flat out contradict another version, or have mistakes in them. And this is all
Right.
part of the beauty of it, right? Is that it creates this like rich tapestry of telling and retelling and uniqueness, right? It does.
Right.
Does Bloody Mary scratch your eyes out? Does Bloody Mary drag you into the mirror? Is she covered in blood? Is she a witch? Is she a ghost? All of these are the answer to all of these questions is yes,
Right.
because they're all equally valid. They're just coming from different locations or different interpretations.
Right. Yeah. So that was a fantastic breakdown.
Yeah, right.
And it's so interesting to have these three like very distinct categories of these stories, and so like helping you actually sit down and write out or to think about your story world and knowing the difference between a legend, a myth, and a folk fairy tale is so important. So a legend now makes a lot of sense. I know I read the book and then we spoke about it again, and now it's making sense a third time, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes you got to read these things 3 times, right? Or experience these things 3 times. But a legend, it makes sense of like a legend being something of rooted in something in history. It just makes sense. It like it's the legend of for the example of Troy. Like that was the first one that popped into my head because it's like, yeah, did that happen? Maybe. Like was it all about a princess? Probably not. But like that was what was told. That's and a group of people in like, for example, in your story world, could believe like for the most part that's going to stay pretty consistent throughout an entire area, right? And with the folk tales, that's when it starts getting down to like those
because I think
individual.
I think on the like when we were talking about that opens up a lot of possibilities for like a game where like let's say you're hunting a monster, Bloody Mary, and then you have to, but you don't, but in this particular case you never heard any of these stories before, so you have to interview a bunch of the locals, and they say, oh well, she's allergic to metal, and it's like, and then this guy's like, that metal, you mean coal, she can't eat coal. It's like, he's wrong, that's why his children are dead, who's giving him coal. And then you have to keep, you find more of these things. It's like, oh, she lives in the forest, and it's like, no, she lives in a cave. And then it's like, no, it's where the birds fly. And then you find
it's a cave in a forest.
It's a cave in a forest where the birds fly.
Right,
and you found all three of them. You're like, this is where she lives, you know? So we're getting pieces of that tale told throughout. But in order to get that, you have to explore the world and understand what's going on. And those folk tales are really, that's really like, that forces you in a very fun way to experience this world and explore and discover it.
Right.
As opposed to being told.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And off the bat.
Legends are similar as well, right? They don't diverge as much as folktales, but you will have like different versions of legends showing up. So it might be that you're trying to hunt down Excalibur, and Excalibur is, according to legend, with King Arthur's body in his tomb, but no one knows where his tomb is. And you're listening to these different versions of the legend and going, okay, this one says that the tomb is in this mountain, and this one says it's over by the lake, and so then you've got kind of like a red herring sort of situation where you're like exploring these different leads and trying to work out which is the correct one. And in the process of doing that, you're learning more about the world, and you're engaging with characters and exploring and discovering new sites, and having hopefully a great time.
Right. And even down with the myths, you have something of like the creation of, or like, I feel like with a myth you can get a lot of like the value systems, or what a culture in a story world really values, depending on what type of, if it's a creation myth, if it's a just a like, how did that mountain get there, kind of stuff, like it feels like you would get a lot of like the culture's like what are like the traits that these people value the most, and that's just so important, because then that helps all these things influence each other, right? Like your folk tales influence, usually wouldn't influence your myths, but like they all intertwine, and how all these things work together in your story world.
Right. And it's this like, but it's true in real life. Like you understand, like the Greeks and the Romans basically had the same gods, but who did the Romans adore more? Like, it was Mars. Mars was a very powerful god, very respected god. But in the Greek world, Ares was like he was like, it was like, no, we're talking about strategic war more than just the blood for war, It was like, Athena was a much more respected god than Ares. Ares was always getting bested by Athena. But I don't necessarily think that was true in the Romans, because they actually liked to go to war. So it's like, that tells you a lot about the morals of that particular place, even though they are very similar gods in that respect.
Yeah, and you can kind of work backwards with it as well, right? I was researching the Greeks just yesterday, actually, and just yesterday I was researching the Greeks. But one thing that I thought was interesting is that the Greeks believed, and probably the Romans as well, I'm not sure, but the Greeks specifically believed that the gods had a lot of say in who got sick and who was healthy, right? And if you were sick, you were cursed by the gods for whatever reason. And so, there wasn't always the greatest healthcare as a result of this belief, because they would be like, no, the gods have done this to you. They need to undo it if you are supposed to be healthy again.
What am I supposed to do? Right.
Yeah. So that's a interesting way of sort of reverse engineering things, right? Like you can create your myths and then think, well, how does this myth inform the culture after it's been around for a while? What are the ideas that people develop about their gods, about their society based off this mythology. So yeah, great way to sort of explore culture with
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah, and that's so fun. And like when we were just, we had recorded an episode just before yours, we were talking about how much fun it is to play in the sandbox because there's just this endless
Yeah.
stream of. Because I mean, honestly, like, maybe if we were actually in a world, or one of the ones that we're developing, that like, okay, so this is a truth to these people. How does that affect the day-to-day life? It didn't even, like, of course it would,
Yeah.
and of course that would affect healthcare if they think that the gods are cursing
Yeah,
them,
right.
and that's such a cool, it's such a cool and such a human thing to have, um and then another thing that I think that we should touch on real quick is the ritualistic traditions. And I know I didn't mention this before, but it's just occurring to me now that we didn't talk about that. Like the rituals that these people perform, or that you can run into in a story world, and how obviously those have roots in their myths, and in their, well, potentially in their folk tales. But like the kind of cool stuff that you can do with those rituals.
Yeah.
you know
Yeah. Well, like the study of folklore, they often break it down into different categories of um, folklore in the sense of like these are the ways that folklore are exhibited in a society, right? So you'll have sort of verbal traditions, and these are things like what's a good one? One of our modern day folkloric verbal traditions would be knock knock,
oh,
right?
right.
Oh, yeah.
When I say that, it tags it for you that this is a joke, and you're supposed to respond with who's there,
Right.
or why did the chicken cross the road? You know it's a joke.
Right.
Or I could say once upon a time. You know
Mm.
it's a fairy tale. So
Right.
these are sort of verbal traditions. Things like happy birthday, singing happy birthday as well is another one. And then you have other traditions that are things like handshakes, hand signals, flipping someone the bird, all of that sort of stuff are folkloric. And then you have it expressed in things like architecture, or clothing, or food. It sort of spreads out everywhere, and isn't just necessarily like sacrificing a goat on an altar on a mountaintop somewhere, right? It encompasses everything. And one of the more interesting subcategories that they talk about, interesting because it's very very little is known about it, is this idea of child law, and this is how children um, filter the folklore of the community that they're in into their world of childhood. And we don't know
Hmm.
much about it because kids tend to be secretive about their worlds. But some of the things that researchers have picked up on are things like hopscotch and little playground songs and jokes and urban myths and stuff that children tell each other. So
Hmm.
that's another really interesting sort of thing to explore if you're developing a community that has quite a onus on its folklore. So yeah, no, there's
Hmm.
a lot of fun little sort of rituals and subgroupings of things that you can sort of inject um, into your story.
Yeah, I think it's important that was an important point to say, that it doesn't have to be sacrificing a goat on a mountaintop
Yeah, right.
somewhere with a special blood altar, and
Yeah, right.
and then they drink the blood and eat the hooves, and then
Boil the
barbecue the
hooves.
eyes. Oh, boil the hoof, right?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
they have to drink it out of a special ceremonial bowl.
Yeah.
The
That's
hoof,
made of
hoof broth
that's made
is
of
what they
yeah.
call it.
That's made from the glassy tears of a Oculus ram.
Oh, right, and then of course it has a virgin's snot in it or something like that, and it's all mixed together and makes this bubbling stew. But yeah, so it has
This
like
sounds like a great story world, guys.
There we
keep,
go.
keep going.
All right, write it down.
All right.
Um, But it's important to note because you're right, because all those things, and even just like down to the way that you would greet somebody and know that it's a friendly greeting, or just on the same way as like starting off.
Well, now I think one of the things that I was just thinking about here is because now like a lot of people are going to be listening to this and be like, this doesn't quite pertain to my story world because it's kind of set mostly in the world that we all exist in. You know what I mean? But it is still important to do these things, right? These are still things that you can do even though you're not going into like the etymology of the world and the creation of the universe.
Right, or making up like your own planet.
Right,
or something.
right. It's your own world, but it's Earth. It's just in this context of your story. Because I think it's still... Can you just rely on the things that we all know on? Or is there a little bit of extra effort that you need to kind of do to kind of subtly change these things so that it does feel unique?
Yeah, I think it depends on like sort of what genre you're working in, for sure. A big epic Tolkien-esque fantasy is going to require a lot more world building and probably lend itself a lot more to myths and legends and folklore. But as we've just sort of touched on, these things exist in every society, even our modern day ones. They just sort of masquerade in different ways. So we don't necessarily recognize them at first, right? You see, there are folklorists that are studying Twitter feeds because of the way that ideas are exchanged there and how they sort of take on a life of their own and influence communities. So it's not just a fantasy thing. It's not just a alternate history story world necessarily, but definitely there are certain story worlds that lend themselves more to greater exploration of this stuff, and ones that maybe don't need as much of this done. But it's still worth considering and exploring, regardless of what sort of genre you're working in. I think because at the end of the day, what we're trying to create here is a place in which your players or your audience, your readers can interact with and empathize with the characters in the world, because that empathy, that intimacy that you can sort of develop with these characters is what sort of creates long-lasting fans, right? I mean, that's why Harry Potter is still popular today. Like it's definitely not for the quality writing or the lovely author. It's because there was empathy created between the readers and the kids at Hogwarts. So it's important to explore no matter what you're working with.
Yeah, let you jump in and actually feel like you got dirt in your hands. Like I got something here.
And,
like there's something different.
And we could talk a little bit now about certain things that certain story worlds that have done this very well, and certain things that haven't quite hit the mark for some of these things. Like, so in your opinion, what is one of the worlds that, like, is it? It's like one of those things where I think when it's done well because you're instantly pulled in, versus when it's not done well and it's kind of thrown in your face.
Yeah, definitely. I think Elden Ring is a really great example of this, which came out after I'd written my book, shortly after I'd written my book, and I was very, very happy to see that they had somehow gotten a hold of a pre-release and given it a read or something, because they were utilizing a lot of sort of what I was talking about, what I was exploring, right? This idea that when you jump into Elden Ring, I don't know if you guys have played it or not, but it's set in this fantasy world called the Lands Between, and you sort of jump in there, and in true From Software fashion, they don't hold your hand at all. It's incredibly difficult, and initially it's hard to sort of understand what's going on here, and that's because all of the story content in that game is delivered to you through you experiencing and interacting with the world. It's not delivered through big long dialogue trees or massive 5-minute cutscenes. It's generally all through you just exploring, seeing how the world is constructed. Maybe you pick up the occasional item that gives you a description that hints at something about the folklore of the world. But oftentimes you're just exploring and putting two and two together the more you engage with the world. And it's one of the only games that has conjured for me um, the same sort of feeling that I had when I was like a young kid picking up those sort of fighting fantasy pick a path books from like secondhand stores and leafing through them, and you sort of never knew what you were going to get, or where you were going to end up. You might be walking through a forest and suddenly you find a dungeon, and it was that same sort of feeling of mystery and mystique and everything, but there was this added element of like they really thought out this world, and they've put a lot of effort into making this world feel like it has layers and layers of different stories and different interpretations of stories, and all that great stuff that creates a fully realized world. Another great one that's more on, I mean, it's a great game story wise anyway, but more on like a narrative design game mechanics sort of end is Ghost of Tsushima, which utilizes folklore to narrativize. Don't know if that's a word or not, but
It is
now. Narrativize a gameplay mechanic of basically working out where you need to go next. A lot of games just give you like an arrow that points in the way you need to go, or a little icon will pop up on the map, or they have a little GPS system in the corner of the screen, right? And all of these things work fine, but I often find them annoying, particularly like one of my all-time favorite games, The Witcher 3, is horrible for this. They have a little GPS thing in the corner of the screen, and instead of watching this beautiful world and exploring this beautiful world, I'm looking at that little GPS dot to like try and figure out where I'm going.
Right.
And so what Ghost of Tsushima does that's so brilliant is it takes the folklore of Shintoism and this idea of kami spirits being in everything, including the wind, and has this guiding wind function where you can just, I think you just slide up on the D-pad on the PS4 controller, and a wind will blow in the direction of where your next objective is. And so you don't have to look at any UI or anything like that. It's all part of the world, and it ties into the folklore of the world as well. So it makes for a much more streamlined experience.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. And that's such a great.
Right.
Yeah. It's such a great idea.
Yeah. You got it. You have to integrate your
Right.
you have to integrate the mechanics of the world into the story of the world, and it makes it that much more enjoyable.
Right. And you know what? And I can echo that on The Witcher 3, even though didn't really get all that far, but I was very much just like, where am I? Looking at the map, looking down in the corner. Where the hell am I trying to go? And you're right, but it's such a beautiful, like, it just looks, it's so, like, extensive that you could just sit and just kind of stare out and watch, rather than having to look down and follow. Maybe. And it's an interesting way, once again, like you said, to integrate the folklore into actual gameplay mechanics, and really get you rooted down and actually cause some sort of an escape, which usually you wouldn't think that a GPS system would like take you out of it a little bit, but it definitely takes your attention.
Right. I mean, like maybe instead of that, it was an eagle that would fly over, or when you get close to it, there was just a couple of buzzards flying around. Something something that would make you use the world to tell you where you're going.
Right.
And like the GPS works in something like a Grand Theft Auto because that's just a part of the world. That makes sense that they would have a GPS in the car.
Right.
But if it's 1970, they wouldn't have one.
Right. Yeah. So. And all of a sudden we're at 52 minutes, which is so crazy. Like we just kind of flew by, and we still have 2 points that we kind of wanted to touch on. Actually, we just kind of did with Ghost of Tsushima, about integrating the world, and partly the reason why we bring that up was making the or discovery through. So we did kind of talk about that, but the discovery of folklore through exploration rather than those narrative dumps. So I'm just realizing that we did do that, and I had in my mind, I can see like the checkpoints, and I just was like, we didn't do that, but we did check that off, right? And how much more valuable
Zoomed
that is.
past it.
We did. Well, it was integrated into another point, and that's why I got lost.
See,
on
look
me.
at it. We're
okay.
even integrating the folklore
Look
of
at
the
that.
own show into the points there. We're the
Right.
magic.
It's magic. So I the last thing to go over here is the pentacle itself and exactly what this device is, and we will show that on the screen now. Do that now, future Frank. And so let's just kind of take a look at it and kind of go through exactly what the different elements are, and how this helps us develop these worlds and help us do the narrative design, and how it could potentially help us do story worlds in general.
Yeah, gosh, you're gonna test me here on how much I know my own stuff. But I think probably what's important to say up front with this, right, is that well, two things really. First off, is that this is just one approach, right? Um, Stories, particularly non-linear stories, uh, there are many ways to approach this. This is just something that I found helpful in thinking about the different components that come together. The second thing, though, is that the sort of basis for this comes from this concept of the magic circle, right? And the magic circle is, you've seen it in every supernatural horror ever, the chalk circle with the pentagram in the middle and everything. And this is a very old folkloric ritual. I think the earliest it's been traced back to is somewhere in Mesopotamia, so like way back.
Way.
And that was done with flour. They'd make flour circles. Flour is in, like, what you make bread out of, not what you pick and smell. But they'd use this to like protect against evil spirits, right? And so there's this tradition that has carried over different cultures for thousands of years of protective circles. And in I mean, fairly modern times, but still, like, I think maybe like a couple of hundred years back from where we are now, there was work done on the concept of the magic circle in relation to play, and this idea that that any sort of ritual that we as humans do, which could be playing a game, watching a movie, it could be going and doing jury duty in a court. All of these things are magic circles. They are spaces that are consecrated and set apart for a temporary world to be created within them, in which it has its own rules and its own sort of structure. And while you're in that circle, the outside world doesn't matter anymore. You're focused on this one thing. So this has obviously been taken into video game study on an academic sort of level, looking at like how games are these magic circles. So that was sort of the origin of this sort of idea is, we're talking about creating a sacred space for lack of a better definition, for the players, so that they can sort of experience this thing separate from the normal mundane world, and hopefully, experience some form of enlightenment or transcendence, through play and through story. The other element, I guess, is non-linear stories. They don't really follow the traditional structure of a narrative. They don't, they may have these elements in them, but it's not like specifically that sort of rising action thing. Sort of the start, the conflict, the rising conflict and then the drop down into the denouement. It doesn't always work that way with nonlinear storytelling. Nonlinear storytelling is more something that blossoms outwards, right? So a star is a really good representation of that because you've got these different points that move in different directions. So yeah, the pentacle of narrative design is just a way to think about the different elements and how they sort of are moving out in different directions and things that players can interact with at any given time in any way they want. Is
Right.
that a good overview?
Yeah, I think
Make
so.
all make sense?
I listen. If I can only get my fiance to understand the magic circle kind of idea, and then like how yes, like you can't just walk in the middle of me playing a game because I'm not here anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not here.
Yeah, right.
So you coming in and talking to me about X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
Like it's not just to pause and just be like, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, not a big deal. I'm just killing these people. Like not a big deal. I'll just stop. Right? It's like you're in something.
Yeah,
you're emotionally invested. Your mind is thinking because you are in a different world. There are different rules.
Yeah.
And the reason why you play these games or you enter into these story worlds, if we just do a big old blanket over it, is so that you're not in this world anymore. It's the escape of this world. If it's something just like we said early on in the conversation that you mentioned, right? We would go and we'd tell these stories. We'd add in our own stuff. And yeah, for a moment there around the campfires or the cavemen, we weren't in our world anymore. There were no troubles. There was nothing on the outside.
Right.
It was just us. We were just here. We were in something else inside of our minds.
See, now it's an intellectual thing when your parents, when you were younger, said, can't you just pause it?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No, Ma.
You can't just...
We have this book. You read this book?
There's
a reason why. There's an academic reason why we cannot do that.
Maybe that's the true inspiration for my book.
Yeah, right there
all the time.
That was the reason why.
Right.
But it's such a great and once again it's on the screen, but it's just such a great demonstration of or illustration of all the different aspects of this narrative design of nonlinear story of a story world that you can explore in detail, and not only that you can explore, but as we all know, people that listen to this podcast, that as an audience member you could feel free to explore and create your own ideas, create your own stories that take place within that world, and challenge some stuff and have fun with it. And end up, being a part of the larger narrative.
Right. And then, and for people that want to create these story worlds, it's important to have these types of folkloric things. And you can layer them into multiple different stories. And like you were saying, that the person who kind of started to discover that he could do this, or they could do this,
Michael Foster.
No, not Michael Foster. What was it? Who Lovecraft?
Oh yeah. It was Lovecraft. He didn't know he was doing it at the time.
Right, he didn't know he was doing it. He didn't know he was doing it. He was just like, yeah, this is a monster and that's something, but I'm not going to talk about that. But he was throwing them out there, and then all of a sudden a group of people latched onto this and started to work these things into existence.
Right.
And but that's the thing. It's like that's why it's kind of in a transmedia world. It's kind of cool. You could have this concept of this legend and be like, yep, it's a legend, and you could reference it in multiple different stories, and then you could be like, well, maybe I should write this legend, and maybe I could anchor down a few things, and these guys are getting this stuff wrong because it's been thousands of years, and this is why they think this happened. Right. He killed the monster. It's like, nope, he tripped and fell and the pole just went up and killed it.
But that's their entire identity.
But
that clan's identity is that they're killers. So that
it's a good get out of jail free card for writers, right? Like,
yeah, right.
Oh, that's not a narrative inconsistency. That's just the folklore changing over time.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah, right.
It makes it real.
Great. Well, Nick, this was a fantastic conversation. So glad for some reference, this has been a battle about a year and a half or something like that since we met already.
To get you
it's been a long time. It's been a long time.
I felt like we've already had 2 podcasts.
We have, because each time that we talk to you, we go for about an hour anyways. But we've talked to you about a couple of different projects that you're working on that we know that we're also very excited about to learn more about with the with Ancestral, which is a story world that we're working on, which is a fantastic one that we won't spoil anything here. And then also, and I can't remember the name, it starts with a T for the perfume company.
Yes, Thornwood Parfum.
Thornwood, there you go.
Yeah, that one's at a little bit of a standstill at the moment since I moved countries, but
Right.
but hopefully we'll get that up and running at some point.
And if you're a true creator, you have plenty of projects that are in a standstill, but nonetheless are good ideas and are interesting to talk about. So we've like I said, we've tried to have Nick on a couple of times, and for whatever this and that, we finally did it. We did it, and you will be back on the show again. We will talk about Ancestral. I know that you guys are really deep into making that world, and I'm looking forward to exploring it and talking and sharing it with our audience, because this is what we need to do to get new audience members and get people excited.
Well, maybe we'll play test a game with you guys at some point where we've just started sort of doing that at the moment with a few people. So watch this space.
Okay, well,
nice,
yeah,
cool.
just let us know, and we will. 100%. We'll have participants.
Of course.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for being on with us, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
No worries.
Thanks for joining us, intrepid explorers. If you want more great content, well, look to one way.
I think it's over here, but this episode was very much about how to create a story world or elements to a story world. If you're interested in learning more, we highly recommend our episodes with both Houston Howard and Jeff Gomez, both Transmedia producers, and know far more than we know because they're experts in their field. So I would highly recommend those. Those are available on the side here. Continue to create your own story worlds, and we'll see you next time.